Now in one of these families had occurred a savage and shocking murder, and since the crime both press and people had shown not only curiosity but a very real pride in us. We discovered to our own surprise that we were the last stand of fashionable exclusiveness, that we were among the few survivors of an earlier and more formal age, that even royalty was more accessible, and that our rare invitations were eagerly sought by all the nouveau riches of the town. And that propaganda had had its result by the time our various cars started out that Saturday morning. There was a large crowd outside our gates as I drove out with the Daltons, and downtown in the city proper police reserves had had to be called out to control the masses who had gathered to see the grieving family arrive for the inquest. I had not been prepared for all this, and to add to my discomfort the ride was constrained and painful. Brian Dalton had barely spoken, devoting all his attention to the car and now and then running a finger around his immaculate collar as though it choked him. And Mrs. Dalton, beside me in the rear seat and looking pale and drawn, had chattered all the way, not so much to me as at him. "Of course, Louisa," she said. "You know and I know that no lunatic did this thing. It's my opinion it was thought out and worked out to the last second of time." "And who could do that?" "I haven't an idea," I replied dutifully. "Well, think about it. It had to be someone who knew all about that house, didn't it?" "You can't mean a member of the family." "I didn't say that," she said sharply. "There are other ways of finding out. And even with all this money gone she must have left something. Those two women ought to be well fixed." That was the only time Mr. Dalton spoke, and he spoke without turning his head. "You might say to my wife that I regard this talk about money just now as execrably bad taste." She laughed her small frozen laugh. "I would be interested to know when Mr. Dalton ever before regarded any talk about money as in bad taste," she said. All in all, I was glad when we had reached the building, passed through a barrage of camera-men and the all made for us by the police, and into the building itself. It was my first experience of an inquest, and I had never even seen a coroner before. This one turned out to be rather a hortatory person, who explained to us and to the 6 men of the jury that a coroner's inquest is a preliminary inquiry, that it corresponds in many ways to an examination before a magistrate, and that testimony is taken under oath. What we shall want here today, he said to the jury, is a truthful statement from all witnesses so that you may render a verdict in accordance with the facts. I suppose the jury had already seen the body, for one or two of them looked rather white. And the formality of identification took only a moment, Dr. Armstrong doing this for the family. After that, the medical examiner was called, to testify as to the nature of the injuries. These, he said, had consisted of 5 blows with an axe, any one of which must have rendered the victim unconscious immediately. Most of them had been delivered on the right side of the head, but there was one which had struck the neck, and severed both the carotid artery and the jugular vein. He considered it unlikely that the dead woman had survived the first blow, or had suffered any pain whatever, this I suppose for the benefit of the family. The jury was then shown a map of the Crescent, and a detailed plan of the Lancaster house. And following that came the first witness, Emily Lancaster, who had discovered the body. I do not think Dr. Armstrong had wanted Miss Emily to go on the stand at all. She had insisted, however, and after giving her some aromatic ammonia and water he helped her to her place. There was a murmur of sympathy as she took the stand, and a breathless silence while in a low voice she gave her testimony. As to the time, she was absolutely certain. I have lived by the clock for so many years, she explained. Otherwise her story was as before, save that she added something to what the police already knew. This was that while she was partially dressed she had again heard a sound from the direction of her mother's room, and that she had then opened the door into the hall, but heard nothing and went back to her dressing. What was the nature of the sound? It was, I can hardly say. Maybe a door closing, or a chair being overturned. It did not occur to you to investigate further? No. I listened and everything was quiet. They let her go at that. She looked so ill that even the coroner seemed moved to pity. And after that the rest of us followed along with our stories, Margaret, Eben, myself, highly nervous, Mrs. Talbot, the house servants, and the police. Testimony was offered that the house was carefully locked that day, and was still found locked after the crime. Details of the search throughout the house for bloodstains of any sort brought the crowd to the edges of their chairs, only to sit back when it was learned that none whatever had been found. The events of that afternoon were carefully detailed for the jury, Lydia Talbot's brief call, her sister-in-law's longer one, her departure with Mr. Lancaster at 3:30, and the careful locking of the front door behind them. I looked around the room. In the rear and standing I could see Mr. Dean, and in a corner, looking more interested than anxious, was Helen Wellington. Mrs. Dalton had hardly moved since the inquest began, while on the other side of me her husband was restless and clearly uneasy. The crowd, avid for sensation, was growing restless when at last Peggy, the Lancasters' housemaid, was called, and the first stir came when she told her story of seeing Mr. Lancaster return some 5 minutes after he had left with Mrs. Talbot. It stunned us all, including the old man himself. I saw him draw himself up, and then subside into a chair again. Yet when he was finally called he made rather a better explanation than we had expected.